good afternoon, and welcome everyone on this fine but frigid Wednesday. And, you know what? Like freezing cold weather, honestly, is probably the best time, I think, to both record and listen to an exciting webinar where it's nice and warm. I'm William, Director of Tech Evangelism at Itential, and with me is a new face, Donnie Page, a new Itential that you might have not seen around before. How long have you been around, Donnie?
A quarter or so of the year. So it started late last year.
Awesome. And you're gonna see Donnie here in quite a few webinars around some really cool stuff. Infrastructure is code specific. So really glad to have you with us. And you have a ton of expertise doing infrastructure as code, cloud specific stuff here in the recent past. And it's just so funny thinking about the evolution of automation in general, because it used to be, hey, like I have my team, I have my tools, I'm doing my thing right here. I'm kind of like working in my own little pocket and help other teams. Do they automate? Do they not? I don't know. I'm none the wiser. But this tooling and then the teams, the way the teams work together and the teams are structured to support the tooling, like all that's kind of evolved and changed. What are your thoughts there as someone that's worked on both sides of that coin?
Yeah, and thanks for introducing me. Thanks for having me. I'm kind of glad to be on, a webinar here at Itential. Pretty excited with the prospects here and what I've learned over the few months. When you're talking about sort of the evolution of automation, you're also talking about the evolution of the teams that have supported infrastructure over that period of time. The introduction of IAC and the ability to sort of code or declare your infrastructure through code in a declarative fashion was very transformative. Really, provided efficiencies and increased competitiveness for a lot of organizations that were trying to get features out the door quickly or new product out the door, right? And I think what happened is you started seeing these teams automate in different fashions. So you had a network team that, was using tools like Ansible or Python scripts or something like that to start automating some of those network changes. And then you had the infrastructure teams or the cloud teams that were starting to, use IAC tools. And then from a security side, same thing. You were having them automate, via some sort of scripting language. And those individual domains were all, going down a path and automating a lot of the work so that they weren't spending as much time, starting from scratch, and they were able to then work on more strategic projects. And I think that evolution of code helped, but then you started seeing teams like DevOps teams and whatnot change and become, DevSecOps, or, then you saw an introduction of like SRE teams and broader SRE teams. And eventually what I think we've come to organizations looking at creating a platform team that, is sort of overarching all of infrastructure and all of those teams. And then they have a need now to take all those great automations those teams have created and sort of stitch them together and manage them and create standards or practices across the board. And as we continue and evolve and continue to go down this path, we need something like an orchestration tool, right? That a platform team can take and take all of those great automations and stitch them together into a single workflow and remove that barrier in between those teams, which consistently has been a ticketing system, right? I need a network. I need, security rights. I need these things to be able to complete this deployment. And we've particularly have passed tickets between those two. So I think we're at a stage now, from an infrastructure standpoint, where we need to bring it all together, have a single team, have a single platform that we can utilize those domain-specific automations, in a more effective way.
I love that. extending the value, extending the control, bringing everything together, and, not working in those little pockets anymore, thinking and zooming out a little bit and taking it to, hey, like I have a service, like what is all the automation that has to happen to bring up this new service across all these teams and have that like really well oiled and executed. What are we actually going to do or look at today? You want to frame it up for us?
Yeah. So William, thanks. What I'd like to do today, and the title of this was One Touch Cloud Deployment. We don't necessarily need to focus, generally from an infrastructure standpoint anymore on, cloud specific deployments with automation, because a lot of the automation capabilities today can thrive across, on-prem or hybrid kind of deployments as well. But today we're gonna show you a workflow that could be driven, from a CI/CD pipeline, right? Via commit from a developer. Maybe it's a tag or a commit to a branch, and that will actually trigger, an API endpoint into Itential to run a workflow to deploy a landing zone for that particular application, and use those domain specific automations in a way that those automations don't need to be recreated from scratch. We're going to use what has already been created.
I love that. And I guess one thing, a lot of our audience is probably network engineers, infrastructure practitioners, and they see that Azure landing zone and the title there for that workflow, and they're probably thinking, what in the world is an Azure landing zone? And as someone that has like just tons of experience in cloud and operating cloud, can you kind of give us the rundown of what is this Azure landing zone thing?
Yeah, so I think as cloud deployments evolved and as organizations were trying to figure out, like, how do I, continually or repeatedly deploy to the cloud in a fashion that I don't need to redo it every time. I don't need to, go through the process. I can just have a landing zone configuration already created, so I know what it's going to look like conceptually to deploy an application that adheres to our standards as an organization, right? So think of a landing zone as sort of that environment that's already created, that already has sort of a network guideline around it and a security guideline around it, so that when the deployment happens, all of those things are already automated and pushed to the cloud. All of the public cloud entities out there have their concept of a landing zone, right? They have their architecture standards, and that's generally most organizations are following. As they create a landing zone for deployment, whether it's to a test region or a production region, or however they're deploying it, but they're going to always stick to this landing zone concept to sort of generalize, hey, these are my standards for deploying to the cloud.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Sorry for interrupting, and I guess go ahead and just take us through this then.
Yeah, no problem. So again, conceptually, the way I looked at this and, think about a cloud deployment is I think about it from say a software company that has, developers that are creating new services on a regular basis, right? And everyone wants sort of a developer self-service approach, or an easy button for the developers, right? The developers create a service, and they now need that service to be deployed, whether it's to test or production or whatever it is. So from an Itential standpoint, right, there could be a CI/CD pipeline that, maybe based on a commit to a branch, triggers an API call to a workflow in Itential, right? So that would be the starting point to this. That trigger then comes in and starts this workflow. And in this workflow, I have individual automations that are created or would be created by those domain specialists, right? So I start off right away by having a ServiceNow automation that creates a change request based on that incoming request from the pipeline, right? So now I'm adding to my source of truth. I'm saying, hey, we're going to make a change request. We're going to add to this environment. And then the second job there that we're looking at is an HCP Terraform job, right? So this could be Terraform code. It could be OpenTofu code. In this particular instance, I chose to actually go through the process of using HCP Terraform API to create a workspace and attach the code to it, the code base to it, to that actually will produce that Azure Lamizo. Then, as most organizations, as they're standing up their landing zone, as a platform team, I generally, I'm going to go through that process, but I may then have to open a ticket to my network team to say, hey, I have a landing zone for a particular application. I need to know what the next available network is so I can associate it to this landing zone. And so, again, I have an Infoblox automation here that was created by a network engineer. And all I'm supplying to that workflow is the size of the network I'll need for that particular deployment.
And I want to make a distinction here. I think something that's really interesting is each one of these boxes, it's kind of you have the platform team that's kind of like pulling everything together, architecting the whole process end to end, but the control is still with the right teams that own that technology that have built the automations. It's just being inserted in here, right?
Correct. Yeah. And think about it. We're not trying to change how these individual teams standardize, or put guardrails in place. Because I think that's where, platform teams can sort of, fall down or fail in some instances, right? Where they start dictating, like, we have to apply these standards because we have this tool that we're using that requires us to have the same across the board. In these instances, we're saying, hey, ServiceNow team, whatever those guardrails are, whatever those needs are from us to be able to create that change request, or whatever it is that you need from our compute team. And I apologize. I'm saying us. I come from the infrastructure side primarily. So, I'm the one that's made those requests to the network teams, requesting the next available network. But, they're using their standards, their guidelines to create, whatever it is that the request coming in from the other team. And so we're not changing their processes. We're not changing how they're doing it, right? We're not changing the script detour. Again, this particular Infoblox workflow is using the API, but it could easily be an Ansible script that we're pulling in that does the same thing with Infoblox. But again, it was developed by the network team, and we're living by their standards from a network perspective. And we're just tying all these together to ensure that, as an organization, we're following everyone's domain expertise guidelines when we're building out these environments.
Got it. Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And just to continue along, so after we have this information, we've created the ticket, where we've created the workspace, we take the information that we've gathered, the network, the workspace, and now we're going to apply that to the next run, which is actually going to be a run and apply within Terraform, within HCP Terraform, to actually create that Azure landing zone and actually deploy that application, maybe deploy a database, deploy the compute. Maybe it's a Linux device, and from an HCP Terraform standpoint, we're actually not changing that as well, right? That Terraform is still going to apply its state to its state file. So if you're using, that tool to be able to look at or manage, state from that particular instance, it's still there, right? We're just, again, using an API to use the tools that the organization is already using and not changing the tools those organizations are using. Again, this could easily be open tofu script that sits in a repo, right? Or it could be Ansible runbook that sits, in a repo or through Ansible automation platform. So we're not changing how any of these domains automate or create these automations. And then the last two boxes there, right? We're going to post a Slack message. The owner of Slack is created, a workflow that I can then just populate that workflow with the message I want to send to the requester. And it's going to now send them a message to let them know their environment's available. And then the last one there, we're going to update that ticket, that ServiceNow ticket, and close that ticket. So what's great about this workflow is I've updated my source of truth. If there's dashboards or reports or whatever that leadership looks at from a ServiceNow or whatever your source of truth is, that was automatically updated and created through this process. An engineer doesn't have to take this in, go in and look at the ticket, update the ticket, right? It's already generated because we already know what needs to happen based on our standards and guidelines that were created as an organization. And we also know that whether or not it was completed or not, because Itential is smart enough to know that it was completed and continue on and close out that ticket. You could do, some human on the loop kind of pieces in here as well, where you maybe have the workflow stop before the Slack message is sent, just so someone that needs to look or, review the landing zone to make sure that whatever I have in Azure or whatever I've deployed in AWS or whatever I've deployed in VMware on-prem is accurate and stable. And then I can continue on with that workflow.
I love that. So you can kind of build up that comfort level. Like, hey, I don't want to run it all the way through the first time and, without having a set of eyes on it. So you can just make sure it's doing exactly what you think it should be doing and what it's supposed to be doing. And then you can yank that out at some point when you do have that comfort level. This is a great, day one exercise. How do you operationalize this? Because all these different teams, it's easy to say, hey, yeah, we have this tool. It's easy for all the teams to use, yada, yada, yada. But how do you actually operationalize it? Or what does that look like?
Yeah. So, if you think about it, right, with IEC tools in the automation process, they're really good at day one, right? They're really good at deploying something, but typically there's challenges with day two with, maybe changing that network configuration or maybe restarting that compute instance or changing out that compute instance, right? Maybe we need to move from Linux to re-standardize on our, Windows web server deployment. And all those things can be, a challenge with that declarative, process where we deployed it. Now we have to take it back. What I'm showing here within the Itential platform is actually our studio, right? Which is the design studio to be able to create these workflows. Within Itential, we have the ability, to operationalize this and create, like I mentioned early on, like an endpoint, so that this particular instance could be called via an API call, right? But again, we're still talking about day one. Within Itential, we have the ability to create a lifecycle around this workflow, right? We have a tool called Lifecycle Management, and within that, we can actually define things within this workflow that we believe we want to manage, we want to understand the history of those items and maybe change those items. So I can actually make day two objects out of this workflow. As I mentioned, it could be a network change. And then all I would have to do is run that particular instance or workflow to change the network. And I don't have to affect anything else, in that workflow And I also now have the history of that workflow, of those changes, when they were made, who they were made by. And again, I can update that in the source of truth. So you still have, I've updated that ticket to say, hey, we now, changed this particular instance and these are the changes. So, I think ultimately for platform teams, they want to be able to do day one deployments, but day one changes without having to scrap or reset or anything by just making those sort of micro changes that you can make from that environment.
I love that. You mentioned Lifecycle Manager and a few of the other parts of our platform. We're going to have to dive into some of those in future episodes. You know what? I just signed you up for a ton of work with our marketing team, because our marketing team's listening to this. You're automatically now signed up for like 10 more of these. So sorry for that. But yeah, I would love to continue this discussion in the next one and just kind of see how it evolves and, how the different parts of the platform contribute to, the overall infrastructure lifecycle, infrastructure health, infrastructure consistency, all these things, compliance, all the great boxes that we have to check. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else top of mind before we hang this up for the day?
Not at this point. I mean, I think, I think for me, top of mind is, again, this evolution and trying to, bring those two things together, the evolution, of automations, to an orchestration level now. And then those platform teams that have to manage all of that, right? To me, those things marry really well together. And I think, any platform team out there that's trying to create additional efficiencies and trying to, help their engineers become, more strategic, they're going to look for things like this. And I think this is, a perfect evolution of infrastructure management.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the first Itential webinar being in the books. And thanks everybody for tuning in.